I'm Dom Nichols, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, Christmas Eve 2025, President Zelensky has revealed details of the proposed peace plan worked out between US and Ukrainian delegations last weekend in Miami that is due to be put to Russia later today.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 24th of December, 3 years and 305 days since the full-scale invasion began. And although we weren't going to be doing any updates today, I will cover all the points for that proposed peace plan, and later, Adderley has a special segment on the Ukrainian art scene and the impact the full-scale invasion has had on the art-dealing world. President Zelensky has released the details of the new 20-point peace plan that the US and Ukrainian delegations worked through last weekend in Miami. Now, just to be clear, this has not been agreed to or worked on in any way by Russia, and there are some points in there that I think Russia will definitely object to. We're told the US are going to put this plan to Russia later today, Christmas Eve. So I don't think this 20-point peace plan is going to lead to an immediate ceasefire. But it is a significant moment, also because it's easy to get lost in the different plans that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. We thought it was important to mark this development, to which we will undoubtedly refer in the future. So the context is, you'll remember that original 28-point plan that was worked up by the US and Russia, which effectively pushed Ukraine towards capitulation. That was then reworked by Ukraine, and that proposal was swiftly rejected by Russia. Then came last weekend's three-way meeting in Miami. That was between the US and Ukraine, the US and Russia, but importantly, not between Ukraine and Russia. But from those meetings, the US and Ukraine have produced this latest 20-point framework, which President Zelensky presented last night. Now, of note, in addition to this plan, there's also a draft three-party security guarantee between Ukraine, the US and Europe, and a separate bilateral security guarantee agreement between Ukraine and the US. We don't know details of those, which obviously sound fairly complicated. Anyway, there's also another document between Ukraine and the US that's been drawn up, focused on economic cooperation. It was described as the roadmap for Ukraine's prosperity, with President Zelensky saying we've made significant progress towards finalizing the documents. So I'm now just going to focus only on the 20-point peace plan. A lot of this detail comes from the Kyiv Independent. The US is expected, as I say, to deliver this draft to Moscow later today. If approved, the final document must be signed by the leaders of Ukraine, the US, Europe and Russia. Those signing any potential agreement from the European side are yet to be decided. Any ceasefire is expected to start as soon as the agreement is signed, but for the agreement to take effect, it must be ratified by the Ukrainian parliament and/or supported by the people of Ukraine in a referendum that would take place potentially within 60 days. Now, there are two issues where Ukraine and the US have not yet reached a detailed agreement, and it will come as no surprise to you to hear that those are the most contentious issues. This is the control of the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and control of the Donbas region and any territorial concessions there. So the proposed 20 points are as follows. I'm just going to read them straight without any analysis to avoid confusion. I'll add a couple of comments at the end. Number one, the signatories affirm that Ukraine is a sovereign state. Number two, the document constitutes a full and unquestionable non-aggression agreement between Russia and Ukraine. A monitoring mechanism will be set up to oversee the conflict line using satellite-based unmanned surveillance, ensuring early detection of violations. Number three, Ukraine will receive security guarantees. Number four, the size of Ukraine's armed forces will remain at 800,000 personnel during peacetime. Number five, the US, NATO and European signatory states will provide Ukraine with Article 5-like guarantees. Following points apply. A. If Russia invades Ukraine, A coordinated military response will be launched and all global sanctions against Russia will be reinstated. B. If Ukraine invades Russia or opens fire at Russian territory without provocation, the security guarantees will be considered void. If Russia opens fire on Ukraine, the security guarantees will come into effect. C. The US will receive compensation for providing security guarantees, although that point has been removed. And D. Previously signed bilateral security agreements between Ukraine and around 30 countries will remain in place. Point 6. Russia will formalise its non-aggression stance towards Europe and Ukraine in all necessary laws and documents, ratifying them by Russia's State Duma. Number 7. Ukraine will become an EU member at a clearly designated time and will receive a short-term preferential access to the European market. 8. Ukraine will receive a global development package detailed in a separate agreement covering various economic areas, as follows. A. A development fund will be created for investing in fast-growing industries, including technology, data centers, and artificial intelligence. B. The US and US companies will work with Ukraine to jointly invest in the restoration, modernization, and operation of Ukraine's gas infrastructure, including pipelines and storage facilities. C. Joint efforts will be made to rebuild war-torn areas, focusing on restoring and modernizing cities and residential neighborhoods. D. Infrastructure development will be prioritized. E. Extraction of minerals and natural resources will be expanded. F. The World Bank will provide a special funding package to support the acceleration of these efforts. And G. A high-level working group will be established, including the appointment of a leading global financial expert as the prosperity administrator to oversee the implementation of the Strategic Recovery Plan and future prosperity. Point 9 of the plan. The creation of several funds to address the restoration of the Ukrainian economy, the reconstruction of damaged areas and regions, and humanitarian issues will be established. 10. Ukraine will accelerate the process of negotiating a free trade agreement with the US. 11. Ukraine reaffirms its commitment to remaining a non-nuclear state in accordance with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. 12. Control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the restoration of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. Point 13. Ukraine and Russia will introduce school courses that promote understanding and tolerance of different cultures, fight racism and prejudice. Ukraine will approve EU rules on religious tolerance and minority language protection. 14. In Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson Oblasts, the line of military operations on the date of signing will be recognized as the de facto front line. A. To determine troop movements needed to end the war and set up potential free economic zones, with Russia withdrawing its troops from these areas. B. Russia must withdraw its troops from occupied parts of Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Sumy and Kharkiv Oblasts for the agreement to take effect. C. International forces will be placed along the front line to monitor the agreement's implementation. D. The parties agree to follow the rules and obligations imposed by the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols, including universal human rights. Point 15 of the peace plan. Russia and Ukraine commit to refraining from using force to alter territorial arrangements and will resolve any disputes through diplomatic means. 16. Russia will not obstruct Ukraine's use of the Dnipro River and the Black Sea for commercial purposes. A separate maritime agreement will ensure freedom of navigation and transport, with the Russian-occupied Kinburn Spit being demilitarized. 17. Establishment of a humanitarian committee that will ensure the following. A. All-for-all prisoner exchange. B. All detained civilians, including children and political prisoners, will be freed. C. Actions will be taken to address the problems and alleviate the suffering of conflict victims. Point 18 of the plan. Ukraine must hold presidential elections as soon as possible after the deal is signed. 19. The deal will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored by the Peace Council chaired by US President Donald Trump. Ukraine, Europe, NATO, Russia and the US will be part of this process. Violations will lead to sanctions. And point 20. The ceasefire will take effect immediately once all parties agree to the deal. Now, some very quick analysis. On that point about control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Washington has proposed that the nuclear plant be jointly operated by Ukraine, Russia and the US, with each country controlling 33% and the US serving as the primary overseer of the station. Ukraine opposes Russian control over the plant. Kyiv has proposed that the plant be managed by a joint venture consisting just of the US and Ukraine, where 50% of the electricity generated will go to Ukrainian-controlled territories, with the US determining the distribution of the other 50%. President Zelensky said, "We believe that for all this to take place and function safely, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the city of Enoada, and the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant must be demilitarized, because at present there are Russian troops and war there, and there is no necessary level of security." So I think this bit is a sticking point, but it's not insurmountable. Now, on the reconstruction, the aim is to mobilize $800 billion. That's the estimated cost of the damage, according to Ukraine. I don't think that will be contentious. On the size of the Ukrainian military, 800,000 in peacetime, again, shouldn't be contentious. 800,000 is huge. And what is peacetime? Is a ceasefire peacetime? Not really. And when you're talking about 800,000 in the military, are you including paramilitary units, special police, etc., etc.? So 800,000, not a problem. Now, the big sticking point, the territorial concessions or the demilitarized zone. This is going to be, for me, I think, the stumbling block. Russia is going to insist on more land. It's a question of how much pressure the US can bring to bear on them for them to accept this. Now, President Zelensky said that's the US, are looking for a demilitarized zone or a free economic zone, meaning a format that could satisfy both sides. We consider a free economic zone a potential option for a sovereign state to choose such a path. We fought for a single word, potential. We believe that such potential economic zones can exist. We are saying if all regions are included, and if we remain where we are, then we will reach an agreement. That is why it says potential zones here. But if we do not agree to remain where we are, there are two options. Either the war continues or something will have to be done regarding all potential economic zones. Now, that's it. That's the readout of the 20 points and some very, very quick analysis on it. I don't think most of the points will be contentious, but there are some very big stumbling blocks still there, I think. There's no pod on Christmas Day or Boxing Day. The next pod is going to be on Monday, December the 29th, by which time we should have Russia's answer to this. So unless there's a groundbreaking development, I'll chat to you again next week, and I will leave you now in the capable hands of Adderley.
Today, we talk about the generation of Ukrainian artists who, at the beginning of the 20th century, contributed to the modernist movement, propelling art from the figurative conventions of the previous centuries and into modernity. We explore which artists are being reclaimed by national narratives and why, as well as the impact of the full-scale invasion on the art-dealing world. Then, we look at the contemporary art scene in Ukraine today through the work of one young and up-and-coming artist and how her generation and their creativity are being redefined by the war. I'm joined first by James Butterwick, an art dealer and collector specialised in Ukrainian and Russian art. He was involved in the Ukrainian Modernism exhibition that took place in the summer 2024 in London and which has toured in several museums across Europe. Then, you'll hear about one of the leading contemporary art prizes in Ukraine for young artists, from Bjorn Geldhoff, one of the jury members, and Lesya Vasilchenko, who won this year's award.
James, it's really lovely to have you in the studio. This is an interview that has been long in the making because last summer you were chatting with David to do an interview about the exhibition on modernism in Ukraine. And, sadly, that interview never took place for reasons that we know. But I want to pick it up where David left it. Tell us about that exhibition at the Royal Academy on modernism in Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century. What was it about, and why was it so special to focus on that moment of history and to present Ukrainian artists separately from the Russian framework that they're usually presented in?
Thank you very much for having me on, Adderley. The answer is, I'm afraid, rather a long-winded one. Very much under the auspices of two curators, Konstantina Kinsha and Katya Denisova. The exhibition actually began in November 2023 at the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, and there were two sources of pictures, which were private collections and state collections. So the Museum of Ukrainian Art in Kiev was a major donator, the Museum of Theatrical Art in Kiev, etc., etc. But what was remarkable about it was how the incredible energy of Akinsha and Denisova and Francesca Thiessen managed to put this exhibition together in 6 months. Normally an exhibition of this nature takes 6 years. And it was quite remarkable that they managed to do it. And I think one really has to pay credit to Akinsha more than anybody, because he recognized that with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the need to present Ukrainian culture as a totally separate entity to Russian. It's something that makes the Russians extremely angry, which means it's even more meaningful. But it's Akinsha and Francesca Thiessen that are the real motors behind it. And it opened in Madrid in November 2023. And such is the importance of promoting Ukrainian culture on a world stage that the opening address was given by President Zelensky. And it was incredibly moving. And he spoke of the need to preserve culture under this sort of genocidal war to destroy it, which is basically what it is. Anyway, then the exhibition then continued to the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. It then went to the Belvedere in Vienna. And when David and I were in communication, it was at the Royal Academy. And it's an exhibition of which I think everybody who took part in should be incredibly proud. And it is continuing. So such was its success that it's now at the Museum of Modern Art in Łódź in Poland, and there are all sorts of moves afoot to bring it back to Central Europe.
So tell us about that narrative, which clearly happened in the early 20th century around those painters, which is showing a Ukrainian identity that is separate from Russian colonial imperialism, and that is also modern and that is patriotic. How does that play out in the art that is in that exhibition?
Well, I think the answer to that is that I think the Ukrainian art developed into a much more patriotic art, because after the revolution, there developed in Ukraine a very much a nationalist school led by Mykola Boychuk. And he was very much the leading light of this new, exciting Ukrainian movement. And it was very much patriotic, and it was very much based on Ukrainian themes. So, for example, it was primitivist art, but with very much Ukrainian themes and Ukrainian motifs in it. Now, this was really begun by Maria Sinyakova in 1914 in her very extraordinarily exotic dacha outside Kharkiv called Krasna Polyana, where she was one of 5 sisters and 3 brothers, and the parents had died, so they were bringing each other up, and it was sort of a nut house of bohemian behaviour. And that's where it all began. But Boychuk took it on to another level. And so in the 20s, it became a much more nationalist school. And of course, the inevitable result was that Boychuk's wife, Ivan Padalka, various other artists were all repressed and shot in 1937.
Which is when the exhibition ends in terms of like historical period.
Yeah, and there are works by Boychuk and Padalka. I think the great flowering, if you like, of Ukrainian modernism took place between probably 1910 and 1920. And I'm extremely biased because one of them is my favourite artist, Alexander Bogomazov, who lived between 1880 and 1930. But together with him is Vasily Yermilov and Konstantin Petritsky. I think they're the sort of leading lights of Ukrainian modernism at a particularly compressed period between 1910 and 1920.
Mm-hmm. Of intense creativity.
Yeah,
then.
It was intensely creative. Yermilov is an artist that is either in museums or in one private collection. Petritsky's only in the state collection, the theatrical museum, and I think there's one picture in a private collection. Bogomazov is much more widely spread. His career was unbelievably tragic, and the beginning of it was he was very much in search of an identity. He then met somebody, he met his wife, she wasn't his wife then, Wanda, and it's a lovely story. It does require visuals because Wanda was an extremely bohemian and very attractive lady, and Bogomazov was this sort of frightfully bookish, rather intellectual-looking figure, and the two should have never have met. But he fell madly in love with her on first viewing, and she thought he was absolutely potty and refused to return his advances. And it took him 5 years to win her over. But once he'd won her over, his career exploded, and he became this really radical artist of unbelievable ability. So when I show my fellow art dealers and museum friends and so on work by Bogomazov, they all go, who is this guy? We've never heard of him before. This guy is brilliant. He really is brilliant. He's an international class artist. And we're just starting to put together his catalogue raisonné.
Why do people not know about him then?
He was underexposed. It's as simple as that. Most of the work was behind the Iron Curtain, first of all. If he hadn't died of tuberculosis in 1930, he would have unquestionably been repressed. Wanda outlived him by 55 years. So all the pictures basically were in Wanda's tiny little flat by the Academy of Arts in Kyiv. But Wanda died in 1984, and the family legacy was taken on by Ragneda and Tanya, the two daughters, but he just was never really exposed. And there were very few pictures in the National Museum. There was the two sections of the Soyuz triptych, which is of vital importance to his oeuvre. But apart from that, there weren't any really great sort of futurist pictures by him. They were all privately owned. And then when the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, and a market started to develop, then a lot of pictures were bought up by Moscow collectors and indeed by Kyiv collectors. And it's a great tragedy that one collection, that owned by Konstantin Grigorishin, he bought it in Kyiv, and it contained some of Bogomazov's greatest works, foolishly took it to Moscow, and of course it was confiscated. And whether we ever see those pictures again, which include some of the greatest jewels of European modernism that one can imagine, I very much doubt.
So a lot of the conversations in the art world, and that we've talked about in this podcast around artists like Ilya Repin or Malevich, is the fight from Ukrainian art historians to have them labelled in museums across the world as Ukrainian and not Russian, because they're often labelled as Russian artists rather than Ukrainian. Is that also what's at stake here for Bogomazov? And are Russia and Ukraine fighting over claiming this artist, for example?
No, not as far as Bogomazov's concerned, fortunately, and the reason for that is very, very simple. Of a 50-year life, he spent 46 years in Ukraine.
Right.
And the years that he didn't spend in Ukraine, he spent in Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed area between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Finland, and he spent, I think, 8 months in Moscow. So he was so much a Kyiv-based artist that they really cannot claim him. The same applies to Petritsky, and the same applies to Yermilov in Kharkov. They just can't claim him. You, unfortunately, have used the word Malevich. Malevich is such a bugbear, unfortunately, and it's one that I get into terrible trouble with because I'm afraid to say I do not recognise him as Ukrainian. There are people who do recognise him as Ukrainian, and please, you are entirely within your rights to do so. But I think there are too many sort of salient points to discuss. First of all, he was indeed born in Kyiv, of parents that were not Ukrainian. And what is, I think, the little coat hanger onto which Ukrainians hang their coat is that he did say in a letter to somebody, I'm Ukrainian. But, you know, I recently saw on an Instagram post that when he was interrogated by the NKVD, he kept saying, I'm Ukrainian, I'm Ukrainian, I'm Ukrainian. I don't believe a word of it. I'm really sorry. I'm sure I should. I don't. It's claimed that he did drawings which were connected to the Holodomor. I very much doubt that, and I think the evidence offered is extremely scant. So Malevich left Kyiv when he was 8 years old, and he did return in 1928 and taught at the Academy of Arts until 1929. But I greatly question whether he is a Ukrainian artist. Furthermore, the Ukrainian state, when they should have claimed him as their own, failed miserably.
When was that?
It began in the 2000s. They wanted to call Borispol Casimir Malevich, but there wasn't a single picture by Malevich in Ukraine. There was a drawing, which was owned by a very dear friend of mine. And apart from that, there weren't any works by Malevich. There were claims that there were works by Malevich. Unfortunately, they weren't by Malevich at all. The classic example being that, I'm sure for reasons best known to themselves, the Ukrainian Postal Service decided to put a suprematist picture, supposedly by Malevich, on a postage stamp. And it came from a well-known Kyiv collection. But to say the work is dubious, authenticity may be the understatement of the century. And when Sotheby's was selling 4 absolutely quintessential seminal works by Malevich at auction, and they were available privately before the auction, the Ukrainians should have snapped them up. And they had absolutely no interest whatsoever.
I think it's so interesting what you're raising in terms of a point, because obviously at a time of war like we're in right now, there's a big battle for narratives and there's a big battle for claiming a history and claiming a national identity, when the world used to be, but also the complexity of empires and shifting borders creates cases like Malevich, where you grew up in a country, you have parents from another country, people are much more multilingual than we are right now as a society. Do you think there's a risk of creating very black and white narratives of the reality of people's identities and belongings, but also just their creativity is just being not erased, but flattened?
You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, you really have. That's a magnificent question. It's such a moot point. It's such a sensitive area. And I'm terribly sorry. I'm horrendously blunt. First of all, Vladimir Putin isn't responsible for example, Larionov, Goncharov, Popova, Chagall, or the great Kandinsky. He's not responsible for them. And I do think it's a dangerous world to cancel them just because of the aggression of one pathological lunatic. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I think that they're rather badly advised on this. They've got tons of their own artists who are really, really good. And in an appalling and shameless piece of self-promotion, I'm going to put forward the name of Dmitry Lebedev, 1899 to 1922, who we're exhibiting next year in Maastricht in Holland. Well, you've got the classic case here of an artist who is based in Odessa. He's Odessan. There seems to me to be very little argument as to whether he's Ukrainian or not, because with the birth of the Ukrainian nation, which basically is 1918 to all intents and purposes, there's Lebedev creating these extraordinary, slightly unhinged symbolist pictures, and therefore to claim Lebedev as Ukrainian is extremely important. He is. The civil war in Russia, or the Russian Civil War as it's known as, was particularly savage on the territory of Ukraine because you had so many conflicting groups fighting each other, including, of course, Petlura, who represented the Ukrainians. So I think you have to argue that there was a Ukrainian state, it existed, and Lebedev lived and studied under that particular Ukrainian state. So claiming it back is one thing. You're right about the other thing, which is it's a dangerous area in which to be.
I want to shift maybe away from the beginning of the 20th century to the time that we're in now. You work as an art dealer, and Russia has been the focus of many sanctions in many different aspects of its economy. How has that affected the art dealing world and your work?
Very badly is the answer, because I had Ukrainian and Russian buyers before the war began, and they've all disappeared. The war began in 2014. And I was exhibiting in Moscow at the time. I was at the Moscow Arts Fair and I was showing Bogomazov. And all these Ruskies were coming onto the stand and going, just making these sort of disparaging remarks about how this is all Ukrainian, you're promoting it as Ukrainian. No such thing. And colleagues of mine who were in the same guild of art dealers that I was in, Russian guild, coming up when they took the Crimea and waving their fists in my face and giving me all sorts of imperialist chit-chat. The Minister of Culture of the time, frightful man, he came onto my stand, I'm the only foreigner exhibiting, blah, blah, blah. And he comes on, he said, so what's this? And I go, Bogomazov, Ukrainian artist. And he goes, Ukraine, not interested. Turns on his heel, walks off. What's quite funny about that is that the very few Russians who did show any interest in what I was showing were going, your prices are insane. Yeah, but I sold most of that stand to the Krolomula Museum the next year, so they were wrong. So in 2014, the cultural battle began. I had Russian buyers. I had lots of Russian buyers.
For Ukrainian art?
For Ukrainian art. But they didn't see it as Ukrainian art. They didn't see it as Russian art either. They saw it as international art. They were not interested. The people who were buying off me were, by and large, they were pretty bright people, and they didn't see necessarily this as the purchase of a Ukrainian artist or a Russian artist. It was, we needed to create the nation, if you like, to create the artist. So when the full-scale war began, of course all the Russians, well, A, they're all sanctioned, and B, they all disappeared. And those that aren't sanctioned are in horror of what's going on and are either sitting in the West or they're sitting in Dubai or wherever it is. And the market for, and a great number of my colleagues have suffered very badly for the fact that the Russians have disappeared off the face of the earth as far as art buying is concerned. They are doing a bit, to my knowledge, but not very much.
And so that's talking about the buyers. What about Russian artists? Have the prices fallen as well? Have they been affected by the sanctions or any of their repercussions?
First of all, there's nothing like the number of pictures on the market that there were, obviously. So Sotheby's, Christie's, Bonhams, McDougall's, they all stopped their Russian sales immediately. And it became a very bad brand to be involved with. The market has dropped dramatically in the West. In Russia, on the other hand, it's on the rise because, hey, they're in a terrible position. So, of course, they're putting their money into collectibles. So the market in Russia is actually very buoyant. You asked me about Repin because something really quite interesting happened with Repin. So the Museum of Russian Art in Kyiv has got, whether we like it or not, the third best collection of Russian art in the world.
Oh, wow.
After the
Okay.
Tretyakov Gallery and after the Russian Museum. And I've actually got a brilliant idea to stop the war, which is you just put all the Russian pictures in one pile. And there's, by the way, works by the great genius of the Russian avant-garde who spent a lot of his life in Kyiv, Mikhail Vrubil. You put it in a huge pile. You take a flamethrower and you say, right, Mr. Putin, either you stop being a major league cretin or else the pictures get it. And I even think he might react. Anyway, so there's a very famous picture by Repin called The Zaporozhian Cossacks Writing a Letter to the Turkish Sultan. It's actually the source of much of Russia's swearing, because there was books of swearing in Russia. It is the most marvellous language in which to swear. And there are several versions of this picture. But a very good version, of course, is in the Museum of Russian Art in Kyiv. And it's been lent to a museum in Lviv, in western Ukraine, specifically to build up the brand of Repin of being a Ukrainian. And of course the Russians are going mental and it's all wrong. And I think it's really funny because, first of all, the swapping of pictures between museums in Ukraine is right up there with pulling your teeth out. So to do this is a very progressive thing to do. And then it's a marvellous way of promoting the Ukrainian brand through Repin, who was born in Chuguyev in 1846.
And who's labelled around the world as a Russian artist, rather Ukrainian.
Again, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because he used, throughout his life, he painted Ukrainian themes. Very Ukrainian themes. You could argue Archip Kuinji, who's actually probably Greek, who also painted lots of Ukrainian themes. His most famous picture is called Polnoch na Dnipro. Well, how do you answer that?
It's got Dnieper in it.
It's got Dnieper in it, yeah.
Yep, that's as far as I could tell.
Well, hang on a second. It's full moon over the Dnieper. So showing the Zaporozhian Cossacks, or a version of it, in another museum. And it's had quite a lot of PR. It's great. Fantastic. Let's make him Ukrainian.
So it's really another way of fighting the war, isn't it?
It is another way. But I do strongly suggest that you listen to what Zelensky said when he opened. After the darkness comes light, to which man always returns. The battle for culture is not just won on the battlefield. There are all sorts of beautiful little quotes in there. And he does speak very inspiringly, and it's a very inspiring text, written, I might add, by Konstantina Kinsha. But, this is a vital battle. We need to start making the West understand that there exists a Ukrainian brand.
Are there any countries from the former Soviet bloc which you can see as potentially going into a similar reckoning as Ukraine is going, not in terms of, obviously, invasion, but on the cultural scene, fighting that battle of narrative, reclaiming artist and identity? Is there a domino effect?
Sadly, no, because the very simple reason is that there simply isn't the quantity of art available. So if you're talking about the Baltics, for example, you've got Klutsis, Chirilonis, they're two avant-garde artists. They're now Latvian and Lithuanian respectively, but it's not a great movement because there simply isn't the number of artists available, whereas Ukraine, with its vast diaspora and its vast art school, the three great art centres of Tsarist Russia were St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kyiv.
And Kyiv, yeah.
And the same applied to the Soviet Union. So it simply doesn't have the mass.
Right.
That's all.
Well, my last question, I suppose, is, has the war led to a form of reckoning amongst contemporary Russian artists? Is there a dissident voice coming out of the art world, like there so often is in the face of tyranny?
Goodness me. I could be being interviewed by Robin Day. That's a fantastic question. And I'm not the person to ask, because I'm not a dealer in contemporary art. I keep my eye on the scene. There is, of course, a great deal of protest art. There's a good deal, in my opinion, extremely visceral art and very angry art, all of which is entirely understandable. I wouldn't say that among their number is an artist that is necessarily yet of world renown, but I'm sure that will appear.
Okay, well, if you know who we can talk to about this, please let me know.
And now, let's fast forward to the present. Many in Ukraine have argued in the last 3 years that the artists, writers and musicians dying on the front line and under Russian fire are yet another generation killed just as they were starting to flourish, yet another generation of promising beginnings, often in reference to the executed Renaissance of the 1930s. But despite the war, the Ukrainian contemporary art scene is, well, maybe not alive and well, but alive and there. Francis talks to Bjorn Geldhoff, one of the jury members of the Ukrainian Pinchuk Art Center Prize, and Lesia Veselchenko, who won the award this year.
The prize is a biannual prize that invites all artists all over Ukraine and all Ukrainian artists right now all over the world to apply with their works as long as they are 35 or under. And we had more than 1,000 applications, which is kind of a wonderful thing to acknowledge that there's so many Ukrainian artists who are making fantastic work, which gives us as a selection committee also an ability to discover sometimes positions we do not know. During the process of selection, Veronika Kozhushko, who is an artist who was living and working in Kharkiv, was killed by a missile strike. And as she was one of the artists being considered, of course, this triggered a lot of emotion also with the selection committee who was actually discussing the work. We decided to select her out of the competition, not only honoring her because she is not the only artist who has unfortunately passed due to the Russian aggression. There are many artists either on the front line or behind the front line who become victim of Russian violence, who have passed away. And for us, it was an opportunity to recognize that. And we started the ceremony with a moment of silence. One of the things that I found incredible is that, throughout this exhibition, which shows 20 fantastic young Ukrainian artists, veterans are coming and they are discovering, they are also feeling, they are joining us on this journey with contemporary art. And I think when then we have this moment of celebration where we celebrate this young, incredible talent, we first and foremost have to recognize that this is a time where celebration is very difficult, and celebration always happens with in mind those who are giving up their physical integrity, their body, their freedom to protect us from doing what we are doing. And that's why we started with this moment of silence, and I think that's just the only right thing to do.
It's noteworthy in art criticism of the last few decades in Britain, in the United States, in much of Western Europe, that people argue art has lost its primacy in human affairs in many ways since the explosion of other forms of art, whether it be advertisements, cinema. The idea of the art gallery has changed over recent decades. But of course, what we've seen in the war in Ukraine is that art is very much at the center of many of the issues you were just speaking to: commemoration, celebration to a degree of Ukrainian culture, which is currently being fought for. How important is art in Ukraine compared to perhaps the way it is perceived in other Western countries?
Let me say that the way that art is important in Ukraine is exactly the same as this in Britain. Perhaps in Britain one doesn't recognize it yet. Perhaps in the US one doesn't feel it yet. Art gives us this ability to think critically in the most difficult moments. I think one of the things that I am so admiring in Ukrainian artists is that at times of war, when everybody is united and looks in one direction, they have to. It's a matter of survival. Artists can manage to do two things at the same time. They managed to love their country. They managed to fight for their country. And at the same time, they managed to keep a critical attitude, to think and discuss sometimes topics which are incredibly difficult in society. Art has that ability to do it outside of the political field. And what we see in Ukraine, what we could see in other countries as well, is that art takes that challenge. Artists take that challenge. They view themselves as politically and socially engaged. They understand they have a role and they have a function within society. And that their role and their function is not an easy one. I don't think it's easy today to be an artist in Ukraine because the stakes are much, much higher. And at the same time, I also want to say that to a certain degree, artists have found back freedom. In a way, in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I think every artist felt obliged to do something for their country. I think today they understand that making their work doesn't have to necessarily address the war. Just by who they are and where they live, they already do. And by the fact that they make what they make and that they make work that is critically thinking, they are contributing to a healthy society. What I was struck by the most when we reopened Pinchuk Art Center in June 2022, we didn't know what to expect. What struck me the most is that suddenly art became, I can't say a matter of survival, but I will say a matter of mental health. For many young Ukrainians, we have 1,000 people every day in the museum. What is more important than that number is the way they engage with art. That has changed fundamentally. People come into the museum because it gives them an ability to think and look at things a little bit protected and away from the violence of the everyday. And I think art has, in these horrific circumstances, found a real raison d'être, as they say. And I strongly believe Ukrainian artists are up to the task. They are aware of that, even though one could even say, if we look at Lesha's work, is that directly talking about war? Well, there are some moments, but it isn't directly talking about war. But it speaks of the sky. And it speaks of the sky from 1918 till today. So our understanding of sky has radically changed. We now know what the sky means. Where it used to be freedom, stars, travel, imagination, now it's protection, it's a risk, it's danger. So I strongly believe that this kind of freedom that artists have taken again to say we make our work as we make it. And yes, we cannot avoid to talk about the war because we live in that circumstance, but the war doesn't necessarily have to be our subject. And it makes them the strongest ambassadors for the country. It makes them the strongest supporters for Ukraine abroad because they are able to speak of Ukraine in ways that journalism can't, in ways that politicians can't. And they can evoke a curiosity and they can evoke a love for Ukraine and Ukrainian culture in very different ways than others are able to.
Thank you. Well, Lesha, you've been listening to that. And first of all, congratulations on winning the prize, and clearly an extraordinary achievement given the number of Ukrainian artists who entered this. First of all, we've heard an overview there of your work, but perhaps you can just talk first of all about the philosophy underpinning your art and describe it for us.
The installation is called Night Without Shadows and Light Without Ripplings of Waves. And this architectural installation combines two video works. One is called Tachyones and another called The Night. The video work The Night is capturing more than 100 years of Ukrainian night. It's combining video recordings of the night sky starting from 1918 to 2025. Another video is called Tachyones. It looks like huge sunrise that is projected about the night and that is playing simultaneously with the night video is 8-minute long video of sunrises that happened over Ukraine from 1990, the year I was born, until 2022 when the video was produced. That's why I wanted to make an exhibition environment that could provoke a bodily feeling. I wanted to make something belongs to the world of intuition rather than information and knowledge. So I wanted to combine these two uncombinable, which is the night and the rising sun at the same time. So this installation is about simultaneity. You see the rising sun that is unfolding in front of you, but at the same time, you see the night that is taken to you in its darkness. And you, as a beholder, as a person who's present there, you activating both of these time temporalities by seeing it. You represent this present moment. You represent the generation of people who's coming to Pinchuk Center to see exhibitions, the visitors, everybody who's in Ukraine and attending this exhibition, they represent this very present moment. And they are a very big part of this installation.
And what have some of the reactions been to those who've seen the installation? How have people emotionally responded to it?
A colleague of mine, she witnessed a woman sitting there a long time and crying, but she didn't dare to come close and ask why, but she said that she was sitting there a long time. So I'm still very curious what kind of emotion, memory that work evoked in that person. That's why I decided to work with the notion of the night. You know, my family is very much into poetry, Ukrainian poetry, and I heard about Ukrainian night since I was a child. It was Ukrainian night this, Ukrainian that. Ukrainian night is the most poetic thing you could imagine. But now Ukrainian night is something else. It's a time of terror. This is time which is weaponized. This is time which Russian Federation is using to attack Ukraine. And this is very, very painful. Ukrainian night is not the same. And it really hurts. And I felt like I can't not work with this darkness, because for me, it's not just about this darkness. It's also about the potentiality that something that is very dark could unfold in it. When we look into a night sky, we see the stars and their light is reaching our eyes, but actually it may be the stars that is already gone for a very long time ago, but their light is still traveling to us. We see something that might not be there anymore. And at the same time, something that looked like a darkness of the night, it could be potentially already filled with light, but it's still traveling to us. And I felt maybe this is what history is. Waiting to tell another story, to be retold, to be recalibrated through the gaze of the present. And also there is this history that it hasn't been discovered yet, but they're just waiting for the right moment, for the right situation, for the right voice, for the right platform to uncover them and to become this alternative narrative that might be so needed for all of us. I find that arts is only place where you can actually talk about it, where you can talk about history as a metaphor to the night, and where you can bring this poetic reference and people will actually feel it, because actually Ukrainian people are very poetic people. And when you say something that belongs to the world of poetry, Ukrainian person will really understand it.
Bjorn, I wanted to ask you about the other entries that you saw. You say over 1,000. Were they exploring the war specifically, or were they more on a myriad of subjects? And also as well, like, how did the styles shift? So were they more contemporary, or were there often some figurative ones as well? I'm interested in what came to you.
I have, unfortunately, I should say, not seen all 1,100, but I can speak of the ones that we have in the selection, which are 20 wonderful artists. And I think the way of making art really varies. You heard Leisha speak about her love of archives, how it relates to the future rather than to the past. but also with a very deep understanding of what's happening today and why this work is so important today. I think at the same time, for example, the second special prize was awarded to a soldier, to Yevgen Korshunov. Korshunov, who serves in the army, who was shortlisted more or less the same day as he was drafted, and whose answer was tenderness. He created portraits of the people he was training with, and they are incredibly tender. They are so beautiful. They are in the same way, you know what Lesha said, Ukrainians are very poetic. I can only say, yes, that's absolutely true. And you see that in these portraits. And this, Francis, it's almost a direct reality of the war today. At the same time, we have someone, you know, first special prize, which was Katrina Alinik. Alinik, who paints her landscapes that are lost. She comes from Lugansk, which in the Donbass. She cannot reach her hometown any longer. She cannot reach the garden where she grew up any longer. So her painting is exactly about this unattainable landscape, the impossibility of reaching it and how it becomes reclaimed in her imagination by nature. I think, is this about war? Definitely it is, because it is about the fact that you can't reach it any longer. Other artists deal with, you know, their own mental health. Can they survive using humor? Others address the subject of the soldiers. For example, there's one work that really speaks of veterans coming home and their fragility. There's a myriad of approaches inside of this one exhibition, and you can't say it's one way or the other way. I think what is important and what I want to repeat is that most of these artists really feel free to make what they always made. And I don't see a lot of artists who throw it all overboard and say, now I'm going to have to make exclusively works that directly speak of the war. They don't do that. They are loyal to themselves. They are loyal to their thinking, as Lesha is loyal to her thinking. If you look in her portfolio, you will see similar interests. Just the detail has changed. And it changes the entire body of the work. And I think that's for many artists the same. There are artists who have investigated the relation that Ukrainian culture has with Soviet and how to work with that subject. They have been doing that from before the war. That's not new to them. That's an old subject. Only if we look at the subject now, our perspective has changed. We understand this differently. And I think it's important. It's important because if artists wouldn't have been loyal to themselves, they would no longer be who they are, and I think it would be much more difficult to take their work seriously. That's why we can take the work of Ukrainian artists so seriously, because they remain loyal to what they have always done.
I remember visiting America and going to the Ukrainian Institute in New York, and they had a special exhibition of Ukrainian artists there, and art in the broadest sense of the term, writers as well, performers. But these were individuals who had lost their lives to the war. And that was in September 2023. And of course, we're now many, many months after that. What do you think the consequences have been on the Ukrainian art scene of the war in terms of lost talent?
Not only on the Ukrainian art scene, I would say. Ukraine sends its best and brightest because they want, because they feel it's necessary to defend their country. And I think everybody in Ukraine, everybody who has friends in Ukraine, they for sure know someone that was lost, or they know someone who is serving. In Ukraine, Ukrainians know why they fight. And they know it's needed. They want to protect that which they know they have. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many incredibly talented people are on the front lines. You have top business people who left their business. You have great artists who are right now serving. You have musicians who are in the trenches. You have writers. You have all great talent of Ukraine fighting for Ukraine. Perhaps it's one of the reasons why they are so good, why they are so much better than the enemy. But it's very unfortunate because, we lose every day someone who would contribute to Ukraine in a way that nobody else would have. We lose every day someone who would have written a poem or a book or a song or made an artwork that would have touched everybody in Ukraine and beyond. We can't say who we lose or which talents we lose because we know we send our talented people there and they go themselves there to defend their country.
I've said on the podcast before, one of the most poignant scenes in The Shock of the New, the famous documentary by art critic Robert Hughes, is he visits Tietval Memorial from the First World War. And he says, people ask, where is Britain's Picasso? He says there's a good chance that he's commemorated here. And I wonder whether people will say the same in the years after the war as they discover some more of these artists who have been lost, whether they will say this person was a great talent that has been lost, as you say, not only to Ukraine, but to the world of culture. Lesha, I wonder if you want to comment on that, and also as well, perhaps in a more optimistic sense, the strength and opportunity in the Ukrainian art scene after the war.
Actually, one of the elements of this video compositions that I have present at the exhibition at Pinchuk Art Center is that my long-term collaborator is my best friend Yura. He's joined the army in the very first days of the war. He won himself. Before that, he was very famous techno musician, and he still makes the best music ever. And he joined the army. Throughout these years, we've been still managing to work together, to collaborate. When he had time in between his shifts, he was making musics for my video works. When I was working on this exhibition, he was filming the night sky in these places where he was staying. It was trenches, and he was sleeping on the ground for a very long time in Donbass areas. Often, the night sky, it was the only way to have a shared experience or something shared together, because every time he could send me an image of a night sky, I could look up and share a moment with him. But also, there is practical reason. The sky is the only images he could send to not risk that his message would be stolen and his location would be read through some architecture or trees and combination with satellite images. It's very dangerous for the soldiers to share any kind of documentation, video or photo with anyone. So the sky became this moment of closeness, and it's very hard to think how many talented artists or people who could become artists, but they lost their lives. It's very emotionally hard for everyone. That's why the community is very united, and there is no single person that I know, artist or no artist, who's not donating. It's like the whole community project. Everybody donates every day. Everybody's making these donations. Everybody contributes. It's so massively organized that I can't even explain to my colleagues from outside of Ukraine how organized this solidarity is. And that's what gives a lot of hope. And that's what really brings some warmth in your heart when you think about Ukraine. You know that people will stand for each other and people will stand for what they think is right.
Is that why you decided to donate the full prize sum to the armed forces?
Yes, I felt like that would be the best moment ever in my life, that I could do such a contribution. Because usually my contributions is donations, but this is like a massive support, and I felt like, wow, I can actually maybe make some change. And then I thought like, oh, it was all worth it.
Well, we could talk for so much longer, but we're running out of time. So is there anything that we've not talked about that you would want to leave listeners around the world with? Bjorn, perhaps you could go first.
I think it's only the first thing we heard from Lesha. I'm extremely excited to know that we will continue to work with her. And she's the first artist we know of who will be in the Future Generation Art Prize, which I think is incredibly exciting. So keep your eyes and ears open for her.
And I would like to add and ask your listeners that every time you're looking into night sky, you should think about Ukraine and people who's looking into the same sky at the same time.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much.
Tomorrow and Friday are bank holidays in the UK, so we will not be releasing an episode. We'll be back on Monday the 29th of December. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and from all the team, we wish you all a very happy Christmas. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and Francis Durnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.